Ja, live løn dig.
Okay, ja, genau. Okay, so hello, Mingalaba. Good afternoon again, everyone. So we already have finished half of this online course, and I'm happy to see that many are still with us. And let's now start the second half of this pretty brief course. We looked at language change generally in the last lesson. Today, let's apply the, okay, recording, fine. So today we will apply this knowledge that we gained in the last lecture to Burmese. How did the Burmese language evolve? How did the Burmese language change to become what it is today? And how is it still changing? How do we know that Burmese changed? How do we know that the language changed? And how can we know what changes happened and when they happened? Now, of course, if we do have inscriptions, if we do have old documents, like we do have in many European languages, then we can just compare old stages to the modern stages of the language. Now, if there are no old documents, if there are no inscriptions, no manuscripts whatsoever, the only way that we can know about language change is to compare the language we look at with related languages. So if you sound correspondences, as we saw in English, F always corresponds to Latin P, for example. And if we know that Latin and English go back to the same origin, to the same mother language, then of course we can see that something must have changed to make this F and P difference. So if you compare languages that we know to be related, and we know they're related because they have a lot of shared vocabulary, maybe shared morphology, so then we can reconstruct an old language, a mother language, the original. So by comparing related languages, we can go back to the origin. Now, if we take Burmese, we know by comparative linguistic methods that Burmese is related to Tibetan, for example. So the language of the subgroup is called Tibeto-Burman language. Now, apart from Tibetan, Burmese is also related to languages like Lahu, Jingpo, Karen, and many others. So we can compare Burmese to these languages. We can compare the sounds and the lexicon, and then we can see what happened. How did Burmese become the way it is today? Now, one thing that has to be kept in mind that is very important, the language and its relationship is not connected to the script it uses. So Burmese uses Indian writing system. The Burmese script goes back to a Mon model and to Brahmi South Indian models, but Burmese is not related to Sanskrit or Pali. It's only the writing that comes from India. The Burmese language is different. So many people confuse the writing with the language. So don't get confused with that. This history of Burmese I give you here is very tentative. So especially these dates are very uncertain. So maybe some 8,000 to 9,000 years ago, there was a language, Proto-Sino-Tibetan, maybe spoken somewhere in modern China. Linguists are still arguing. We really don't know about the time and the place, but this is a likely scenario. This could be. Probably about 6,000 years ago, these Sino-Tibetan language families split into Chinese and Tibeto-Burman, Proto-Tibeto-Burman, probably spoken somewhere in the Himalayas. Then this Tibeto-Burman group again split into what we now call Lolo-Burmese. So this covers languages like Lahu and the part of the Kachin languages, and Burmese with its varieties. This was spoken somewhere probably in the eastern Himalayas before this group migrated to the Ayeyarwady plains. This migration happened probably around 1,500 to 2,000 years ago, that Proto-Burmese people migrated from the mountains of the Himalayas to the plains of the Ayeyarwady in what today is upper and central Myanmar. And then only about 1,000 years ago, we get the first document in Burmese, the first inscription, which probably is the Myazedi Yazaguma inscription found in Mingaba in Bagan. So this is a very tentative and sketchy history of the Burmese language. And I just want to give you a few examples now of what we can tell about how Burmese changed from Proto-Tibeto-Burman. So remember, Proto-Tibeto-Burman, spoken about 6,000 years ago, probably. Some sound changes that we can reconstruct because we can compare Burmese with other Tibeto-Burman languages like Tibetan, Chimpo, Karen, and so on. Again, on the left side, you have the forms marked with an asterisk, which means we don't have evidence of these. They are reconstructed. So you see that Tudai is Söy in Proto-Tibeto-Burman, and little small is Zöy. In Burmese, they're both written with a da today. One is de, the other de. Silver, dmul, becomes mue. To hear, gla becomes cha. Ga becomes ka, and so on. So you see, these are changes that we can reconstruct because we can compare related languages and we can say something about what Proto-Tibeto-Burman looked like. And we do see some regularity. Sound changes are regular. If they happen in all words. So we can say that voiced consonants in Proto-Tibeto-Burman become voiceless in Burmese. So you have the example of the last one here, doom, a post or a pillar, which becomes dai in Burmese. So D changes to non-aspirated plain T. Voiceless consonants of Proto-Tibeto-Burman become aspirated in Burmese. So what is ka in Tibeto-Burman becomes ka in modern Burmese. So you always get ga becomes ga and ka becomes ka. And this happens everywhere. In some cases, like sbal in Proto-Tibeto-Burman, a frog, this becomes pa because the S made it voiceless at some point, which then becomes aspirated in Burmese. So these are regular sound changes that differentiate modern Burmese from the original language, Proto-Tibeto-Burman. One important point is we cannot reconstruct tones probably for Proto-Tibeto-Burman. We come back to Burmese tones later, how they probably originate. You can see here de and de. There is nothing here that would make a tone. And gla becomes cha, ga becomes ka, but na is na. So there is nothing tony probably in the proto language. We come back to this later. We also come back to this S to the. This is something pretty recent in Burmese probably. We have a look at this in a minute. Also, some grammatical changes happened before Burmese became Burmese, but after Proto-Tibeto-Burman language. Proto-Tibeto-Burman did have some sort of morphology, derivational morphology. The most well-known of these morphemes is the prefix S. S could be attached to verbs to make them causative. Causative means make someone do something. So if you look at Tibetan, you have ring, which means to belong, probably related to Burmese shede. And you add the S prefix to get sring, and this means make something long. So to belong is the base. Sring, make long, make something long, is the causative. And we have this S prefix in basically all Tibeto-Burman languages. In Chingpo, it's still very frequent. It's probably still productive. You still can form new words with it. So you have lot, to be free, and shalot, to set free, make free. Lot, to be free, of course, is the same as Burmese lute. And shalot in Burmese is hlute. So there you already get this idea that in Burmese, this S has been not lost, but it changed to aspiration. So from to fall off, pyote, you have pyote, make something fall off or cut off. Similarly, you have nyine, to be high, and make something high, elevate something, nyine. So you don't have this S anymore that you had in Proto-Tibeto-Burman, but you have aspiration. And this aspiration is written sometimes with hato, sometimes with a different consonant in Burmese. The original S is still seen in two words that I've noticed in Burmese, namely te, put to bed, make a child sleep, from eite, and twin, to put in, insert, from wine. Twin also comes with a change of tone that happens sometimes with the causatives. We saw that this Burmese ta sound goes back to an original S. So this is where we still have this original Tibeto-Burman prefix S. Importantly, in Burmese, this morphology is not productive. You cannot make new words with this. It's only there in the lexicon in words that already have been built long time ago. So unlike Chingpo, you cannot form new words with this causative. So this is a few things that happened before, things that we can reconstruct that happened before Burmese became Burmese. Now, from the 11th century, we do have documents of Burmese. We do have inscriptions, we have manuscripts, we have mural paintings with writing. Now, the Myazedi inscription, probably the first inscription, the oldest inscription of Burmese. There is some argument, some discussion that there have been older, earlier Burmese inscriptions. Michael Antwin has argued that Burmese was written before Mon. The argument is not very strong. So this is the first secure Burmese text that we have. And if you look at it, this is in modern Burmese characters. If you look at the real inscription, it would look different. The characters are not round, they're more square. But even if you read it like this in modern Burmese letters, it's not very easy to understand. It's not very easy to read, I guess, because words have changed. So here we can see that changes have occurred. This is transliteration, just letter by letter into English, and this is the translation. So we do understand Old Burmese, and the Myazedi inscription, as you probably know, was written in 4 languages. Besides Burmese, it has also Mon, it has Pew and Pali on the other faces. So we have a pretty good idea about the meaning of this inscription. If you try to read this text, I guess you will give up pretty soon. You maybe don't even know how to read something like this, like Yagao Hatu the Chongi and Yablete. So the spelling has changed, but also the pronunciation, the words have changed. I took a few example words from this inscription, just so we can have a look at what Burmese sounded like or looked like 1,000 years ago. So the first word here is written glok. Glok in modern Burmese is pronounced chao, and it means stone. This chao has the same pronunciation as to be afraid in modern Burmese. In Old Burmese, stone is glok, and to be afraid is grok. So different pronunciation. In modern Burmese, you still have different writing at least. Then you have burha, which today is Pia, Lord. You have things like Gyon, which is today June. And you have Glong, which became Jiao. And again, you see, you have a tone difference in modern Burmese, but there is nothing tony written in Old Burmese here. There is no wis and no bao or anything. So you can see the sound changes that happened. One interesting word is also this one, blok, which means to do. In modern Burmese is biu, biude. Blok becomes biu. It's regular, but it still looks pretty different. So from comparing Old Burmese inscriptions with modern Burmese, we can see what changes happened in the last 1,000 years. But how can we know how Burmese was pronounced? How can we know, if we have this Yazidi text, how the people 1,000 years ago actually spoke Burmese? Now, a few years ago, there was this great Buganki Yamachausa Abidan that was published in Burma, and it lists many words found in the inscriptions, and it also comes with pronunciation, like what is spelled pa, la, and sata. Pronunciation is given as pie. Of course, this is the modern Burmese pronunciation. This is certainly not how Old Burmese was pronounced. So this dictionary is very good, but the pronunciation is certainly wrong. It's certainly flawed there. Because how can we know how Burmese was pronounced? Well, we can look at the way that the words are spelled in Old Burmese. We know that Old Burmese took the writing system from Mon. Mon was the first language written in Bagan. And we know that Mon is based on the Pali model. So we have Old Mon, we have Pali, we have Modern Mon. If you compare this, we can figure out how Old Mon was pronounced. Now, if we know how Old Mon was pronounced, what sounds Old Mon letters represented, what sounds were written with the letters in Old Mon, and we know that the Burmese took the Mon writing system to write Burmese, it is very likely that the Burmese tried to make as good as possible a match between the letters and the sounds of Old Burmese. So if you start writing your language by taking the sounds, the letters of another language, you will probably, very probably, take the letters of the other language to be as close as possible to the sounds of your language that you want to write. So Burmese at the time listened to Mon, looked at the Mon letters, and started writing their language with these sounds and letters representing these sounds. To give you an example, we know that religion in Pali is pronounced sasana. Sasana is still the way it is pronounced in Sri Lankan Pali pronunciation, for example, that hasn't changed much. So sasana, that's pretty certain that this is the Pali pronunciation. We can also be pretty sure that Old Mon pronounced this word as sasana, because that's still the way it's pronounced in modern Mon. There's no reason why we should think it was different in Old Mon. Now, the Burmese at the time in Bagan used the spelling which today is pronounced dadana. But as they write it like this, we can be pretty sure that what today's ta was actually pronounced as sa in Bagan. Because if the Burmese had already pronounced sasana as dadana back then, they would maybe have written like this, with ta from Mon, because this ta is closer to the Burmese pronunciation today from the Mon perspective. So if the Burmese pronounce it as sasana, they will probably write it like this if ta is still sa. If Burmese at that time had already made the sound change from sa to ta and ja to sa, this is what you would expect the old Burmese to have written sasana like. Because now imagine you have to write Pali now in Burmese letters. And you hear people's pronunciation, Pali or Mon, sasana. This is probably what you would write in Burmese, because this is the closest you can get. So from this way of spelling, we can figure out how Burmese was pronounced, and that the change from S to th had not happened yet in Bagan. Similarly, ra had not changed to ya yet, and bla and bra had not changed to bia yet, because there's still the writing bla and bra and bia. So 3 different ways of writing. That means it's very likely that the pronunciations were different of these 3 combinations. So from the way of spelling, we can figure out what the pronunciation was like. Then another source or other sources that we can use to figure out old pronunciations is foreign sources, like Chinese, Arab, Indian, European reports about Burma, Burmese, or Burmese loanwords in archaic languages, languages that have not changed much. Now, a few examples here from Burmese grammar that was published in the mid-19th century in 1845. Thomas Latter, the grammar of the language of Burma, then still spelled with an H at the end. Now, in the mid-19th century, the Burmese letter sa, salon. The author writes that this is pronounced like tsa, not sa, but tsa. So language is not zaga, but tsaga. So this tsa is still closer to the Pali pronunciation cha. So this suggests that there was a change from cha to tsa to sa at some point in Burmese. And obviously, about 200 years ago, this change was not complete yet. Other changes that were not complete yet. Ra, or yagao, has the power, has the sound of ra in run. And interestingly, the author says, the Burmese proper cannot pronounce an R, but they pronounce it as ya. So the author here says that this sound, ya, should be ra, but the Burmese cannot pronounce it correctly, so they change it to ya. But the Arakanese, the Rakhine, still pronounce it as ra, which of course you know that in Rakhine, it's not Yakhine, but Rakhine, they still have the ra sound. So these are changing to ya, ra to ya. That was still going on about 200 years ago. And also da. Da is approaching to an S, combining the sound of th with s. That means the th had not really changed from sa completely yet by the time this grammar was written. So about 200 years ago, maybe less than 200 years ago, there was the change sa to tha, still going on. This change is going on now for many people towards ta. So we have sa to tha, and now it's pronounced ta by many people. So these are sources that we can use to reconstruct these changes. Now, why did the changes happen? I've told you before, speakers are lazy. We don't like to use too much energy when we speak. And the sound ra takes quite a lot of energy. The r, you have to trill your tongue and takes a lot of breath and energy. So speakers are lazy. You know, those lazy young people, they don't know how to speak correctly anymore. So the ra became ra, 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 ya, and then just ended up being ya at some point. At some time, this pronunciation of ya instead of ra became accepted as a standard. So today, saying dwalo yare is not considered bad pronunciation anymore in standard Burmese. But if you say dwalo rade, this would be wrong. So this change has become the standard. Not in Arakanese, and it's sometimes still retained in Inta and Taungyu varieties of Burmese, the ra sound. But in Inta, it's being lost very quickly these days. So this is a change that started with people being lazy, not pronouncing correctly, and then the change becomes standardized. It becomes a new standard. So if you hear people saying today that young speakers don't pronounce the salin correctly anymore, they pronounce it like salon. Maybe in 50 years and 100 years, this will be the new standard. And there will be just one sa in Burmese, like there is only one ya now. So now you have the Yapala and Yagao are the same. So maybe at some point, Salo and Saleh will be considered the same, written differently, but same pronunciation. So this is how sound changes happen. And similarly, the old S at some point became pronounced like the or th. This could be fashion of some people. It could be that some prominent people had this mispronunciation of S as the. And then again, they spread and became the new standard. So today in Burmese, if you say, Jano Swame, this is just considered wrong. You have to say Jano Dwame. Again, this change did not happen in Inta and Taungyu. So the Inta call themselves Angsha and not Inta. And if they eat pork, they would Westha Sare. So the change did not happen everywhere, but it became standard in Burmese and Arakanese as well. And also in most Karenic languages, they have to change sa to tha, but not in Pa'o. And Pa'o is very close to Inta, of course, geographically. So maybe it's just that area that didn't make that change, but all the rest made the change. Now, these examples show you that the lazy pronunciations, the wrong pronunciations of some people may become standard, especially if they're taken up by influential people, if they're taken up in the modern time by the media and at some point in the education. So lazy pronunciation leads to sound change. Now, can we know when these changes happened? How can we know? We've seen the sources, the European sources that show us that maybe about 200 years ago, this was an ongoing change. But we can say something about the relative sequence of these changes. We know that in Burmese, kya changed to cha. So what you spell as kya is pronounced as cha in modern Burmese. We know that cha changed to sa. So the Pali word chitta becomes say in Burmese. And we've seen that sa changes to ta. Now, which of these changes occurred first? If you look at scenario 1, kya becomes cha, then cha becomes sa, and sa becomes ta. As opposed to scenario 2, where we would say sa becomes fa, then cha becomes sa, and then kya becomes cha. Which of these scenarios is more likely? Which way did the changes go? And why can we tell? Well, obviously, it must be scenario 2 that is the correct sequence. Because if scenario 1 is what happened, or would be what happened, then all the kyas become cha first. Then also the new cha would become sa. And the new sa would all become ta. So in this scenario, these words would be pronounced ta, te, and tadana, because they would all go towards ta in the end. Whereas if first S changes to ta and nothing else happens to ta, that just remains, then cha changes to sa. Now this change has already happened. So the new sa does not change to ta anymore. This step is completed. So the new S is safe from the change. Similarly, when kya becomes cha, this change of cha becoming sa is already complete. So the new cha is safe. So logically, it must be scenario 2 that is the correct one. It must be scenario 2 that happened. So we can say something about the relative timing, at least, of these changes. Also, we can say something about the spread of Burmese, because in Inta, as I said, sa did not change to tha. That means Inta was separated from standard Burmese at some point before this first change happened. It's not likely that Inta changed sa to tha and then back to sa again. Of course, this could happen, but it's not very likely. And also in Karenic, I told you, all S became th, but not in Pa'o, northern Pa'o, spoken in the Taungji Inlet area. There, the old S is still S, but in southern Pa'o, spoken near Datong in Mon State, there you have the change. So this means this change from sa to tha is not really completed yet. It's still happening. And you can see from Burmese loanwords in northern Pa'o, Burmese saya is sara. But in southern Pa'o, they pronounce it as tara. So even the new S became tha in Southern Pao. So this is basically what you would expect in scenario 1, that all S, also new S is becoming tha. So we can say something about the timing because of the logics of the change, like scenario 1 against 2, and also loan words in other languages, again by comparing. Now these changes, even if they become standard in the spoken language, in the written language, sometimes differences are retained that are not seen in the spoken language anymore. So you have spellings, to with tata and pata. They're both pronounced as to, exactly the same in modern Burmese, but the meanings are different. So if you go to the bank, you can buy some to, and this must be spelled with the tata, although many people spell it wrongly because it sounds the same. But to is if you wrap something. So different spelling, different meaning, but same pronunciation. And in Old Burmese, there was a difference in pronunciation, very probably. So you had tut against tu. And this is true for all these examples here. So from the spelling, we can, in many cases, still see differences that were there in the language at some point, but are not there anymore. And of course, these spelling differences with the same pronunciation lead to a lot of confusion with people who tend to misspell words then. Now I said tones cannot be reconstructed for Proto-Tibeto-Burman, probably. Maybe tones in Burmese are not very old. Maybe tones came into the language after Bagan. And this we can tell from the spelling of Burmese tones. So the Augamye, you see, is spelled with final glottal stop. So you have the ta, which is what today is Augamye, or short vowel, the Augamye tone in Burmese. This was at some point reduced to a small dot below the syllable. So this goes back to atta. In Mon, you still have atta, and you have the Augamye, which in Mon is abogamye. It's put above the syllable, not below, but it's the same thing as in Burmese. They're still pronounced as a final glottal stop. So bu in Old Burmese was probably pronounced as blo, with a real glottal stop at the end. And Dami, the daughter, you can see in Old Burmese, is spelled with final H. Now again, in Mon, both Old Mon and Modern Mon, final H and Wisdom are pronounced as final H. So based on this spelling of Old Burmese, we can say we have pretty good evidence that what today is the creaky tone originally was a final glottal stop. So to dance was maybe something like ga, which became later ga. What today is the heavy tone, spelled with Wisdom probably goes back to final H, which was pronounced as final H, like Samih. Samih, daughter, which then became Sami or Dami. So the spelling of Burmese suggests that tones are something pretty new in the language. Other changes in the language that we can observe, there's not only the change in single sounds because of laziness, there's also reduction of words. So if you have an original form, Jun Do, this is always pronounced today as Jana. Similarly, Jun Ma becomes Jama. These forms are standard in the spoken language, in the written language, you should still write it like this, although Jana and Jama spelled like this are pretty frequent in informal writing. You can even see it sometimes in printed texts. So this may become the new standard at some time. In other cases, like bilu becoming balu, you just reduce the first syllable, make it shorter. And in other frequent names, especially place names, you would drop one syllable. So Mandalay becomes Manly, Molamyai becomes Momyai. Obviously, 3 syllables are too much. You want to have only 2 syllables. So we get rid of the short syllable in the middle. These things happen spontaneously. There is no rule as to which syllable is reduced, how you shorten a word. So in Manlay and Molamyai, you cut the medium syllable, the syllable in the middle, and the le, mo, lamyai, the and la are dropped. But in telepon, you drop the teli and just speak of po or phone. So there's no rules. Also, when you have names of people with 3 syllables, they are sometimes shortened to 2 syllables, and you can never be sure which one is dropped. So in some cases, parts of the word are cut, not only syllables with no meaning, but whole parts. So train should be miyata, but usually only talk about yata. What you see a lot now about the print media, the Densa, Jane, and magazine. This is shortened to Sanezin. And then you see things like Sanezin de Ma, which is people working in the print media, I guess. So you have these 3 words, and this is too long, of course. You just shorten it and take 1 syllable of each. Then, as I said, telepon becomes pon. Bolombue is easier to just have bobue. And for toilets, of course, you cannot write the whole word for ladies and gentlemen. So it's only tiger and lift, ja and ma, instead of yao ja and mei ma. So you can just cut parts of the words. You can also merge words or syllables into one. And this happens a lot in the spoken language. So mayawu is pronounced colloquially as miawu, and also written colloquially sometimes as miawu. The favorite breakfast dish, mohinga, is pronounced as muinga. Agoji as gui. So this is colloquial, spontaneous shortening that just happens when you speak fast. This is normal. In some cases, the fused forms can also become part of the standard language. So the original Jono, the small servant, becomes written as Jono, like this, and colloquially pronounced as Joe, especially in Anya. So Jono is merged into one word as Joe. And this has become standard. No one would argue that you have to pronounce it as Jono. While as Mohinga, people would still say maybe it's not Muinga, it's Mohinga. So maybe it needs some more time for the other ways of pronouncing will become standard. Then there's not only sound changes, of course, in language. We have seen this in the examples of English. There's also changes in the meanings of words. So a word can take on a new meaning or new meanings. We just saw the example of Jono. Jono means a small little slave or servant, but the meaning now is I or me. You don't think of servants anymore if you speak about Jono or Joe. A very similar development can be seen in Lao. where ka noi, ka is servant, noi is small. So ka noi is no. And also in Lao, this has been merged into one syllable, koi, from ka noi. Like no becomes jo. So this is something that happens in the area quite a bit, obviously. Then the word min, which means king or ruler, is used as you. Usually, well, basically, this was a polite form. But in modern Burmese, min is not really polite anymore. Min is familiar, intimate. So this is a change in meaning. Other words that have changed their meaning, I already talked about the maite in the last lecture. Maite, which means crazy or idiot, now means cool. So it became positive in the meaning. Then the Pali words, the de and bisi. Bisi now just means thing in Burmese. In Pali, but bisi in Burmese is just thing in general. The de sati is awareness in Pali, and in Burmese you use it in very common expressions like the de taba, the de yade, and so on. So these are changes that happened in words. Words took over new meanings. In other cases, a meaning comes to be expressed by a new word. So Old Burmese, no, mouth. At some point, obviously, was, I don't know, was it impolite to use that? Whatever. It was replaced by ba sa, baza. And ba sa is where the cheeks come together. It's the border of the cheeks. So something very new. I don't know why this happened in Burmese. Maybe no became impolite, sort of taboo. In other cases, like they, very, this became too weak maybe at some point. So you don't hear things like they gaune that much in spoken language. You hear the negation, they magamu, they mawebu. But to make a strong expression, you would rather use something like a yan gaune, or something even stronger. And this changes very quickly. So some people use things like ye sese gaune. There was a song some years ago by a famous CDM singer. The song's name was ye sese chite. Yese is something negative, basically, but ye sese chite, I damn love you. This is positive, of course. So you need newer, stronger expressions all the time. Meima and Yao Jia took over meanings of wife and husband for many people. So they're replaced by the myodami and the myoda, which also took over then the meaning of husband and wife at some point. So you see, these things just change all the time. In some cases, well, we have spoken about reanalysis in the case of hamburger in English. Now in Burmese, these days, you read a lot about the bay from the bay Mao. The word the bay comes from Pali, Sanghapata, a monk's bowl, the alms bowl. And of course, in Burmese, it's just the alms bowl, basically. Now you have the expression, the bay Mao, turn over the alms bowl, which means the monk does not accept food for donations. And this, of course, is a very strong signal of the monk towards the lay person. If the monk says, I don't accept your food, that's what the worst the monk can do. So the Bei Mao came to mean to boycott in general. So today you don't have to be a monk to the Bei Mao. You can be a normal person and not drinking Myanmar beer, for example, not using Mytel telephones, just to the Bei Mao. Now from this, the Bei Mao, there was reanalysis of the word the Bei, probably to mean protest or boycott on its own. So this the Bei originally has nothing to do with boycott or protest. It just means alms bowl. But going through the stage of the Bei Mao, it can take over the new meaning of the Bei, of protest to boycott. So it got a life of its own. Today in the Myanmar dictionary, there are 2 entries for the Bei, one alms bowl, one protest boycott. I'm pretty sure they go back to the same Sangapata, which has nothing to do with boycott or protest at all. So reanalysis in the lexicon. We have seen changes in the grammar in English, like I'm going to eat. Be going to, meaning not move from one place to another, but do something in the future. In Burmese, many changes like this happened also in the syntax and morphology. You have an old verb, sede or che in Old Burmese, that means to command, to order. This, in modern Burmese, just became a suffix to mark causative. Remember, Tibeto-Burman had the S prefix for causatives. This is not functional anymore. In Burmese, it's not productive anymore. So the suffix se took over this. So if you have bude, to be hot, and you want to say something like make something hot, you cannot do something like sapu or pu, but you have to add the se suffix, pu se de, pu se di in written Burmese. In spoken Burmese, the se is less common, but they still have it, mapu se jimu. Another word, pu, which in earlier Burmese just meant to look, to see. You still have it in the context like pea pude. This pu became experiential suffix, meaning have done before, at least once. Sa bude, yao pude. I have eaten this before, I have been there before, at least once. This is called experiential. I've had the experience of doing something. Now, look and see is quite far away from experiential, but of course, to look, see is an experience. So experiential is certainly connected to the idea of looking or seeing. Then chin used to be a verb on its own, meaning to wish, to desire. Today can only be used as a suffix on a verb dwajine, sajine. You cannot say things like mchimbu or chine. So these are changes in the grammar. Verbs became grammatical, morphological affixes. And the last point here, we've been talking about the development of negation in some European languages. In Burmese, something similar to French happened actually. In Old Burmese, you had 2 prefixes marking negation, ma and a. So in the Miazedi inscription in the last sentence, there is the expression apura ji, which means matwiyazi, matwezeya. So a pu, ma pu, mamyi, matwi. And you also had ma prefix like in modern Burmese. In early Burmese, and also in written Burmese, you only have the ma prefix, masa, madwa, with some suffix maybe like ba or chi or whatever. In modern Burmese, at least in the spoken language, you have ma and then the verb and then bu, masabu, madwabu. And then in colloquial Burmese, the ma is dropped and you just have Sawu, Dwawu. This for many people still has a connotation of like not being very happy with the situation, being offended, being a bit moody. Sawu, like I don't like this food. So you have the ma prefix becoming a bu suffix. Of course, they are not related. But where does this bu come from? Probably, I would say it is the same as the experiential pu. So you have an expression like mayao pu. I've never been there. With the pu experiential, which goes back to look or see. And this never then just becomes generalized to not. Like in French, we have seen ne va pas, not go a step. And then the step that was used only to reinforce the negation originally, this becomes then the only negation. So in Burmese, probably this experiential pu took over the function of negation. It was nothing negative in the beginning, but it became the negation just through usage and dropping of the weak ma prefix. This is sort of reanalysis similar to French. Now in modern Burmese, of course, pu experiential and pu negation are spelled differently. So they're felt to be something different. They can occur together. So they're clearly different words today, but this does not mean that they do not go back to the same origin. Like in English, you can say things like, I'm going to go. So because going to has been reanalyzed, grammaticalized enough to be different from to go as a full verb. And this is what I wanted to tell you about language change in Burmese. And in the next lesson on Wednesday, we will look at multilingualism using more than one language as a person and as a society. And you're welcome now to ask any questions if you do have any. The floor is yours if you have any questions. If not, as you know, you can always send emails. Okay, I don't see anyone raising their hand or asking anything.
Hello.
Yes.
So I think if there are so many changes, like on the Facebook, there's so many spelling error and so many changes in the language. So my question is, these changes like spelling error and other word will be a problem or just a normal case?
The spelling errors made in informal chats, you mean, right?
Right, sir.
Yeah. So maybe at some point there will be a spelling reform in Burmese. Maybe at some point things like, where is it? These things like toe and toe, now spelled with tata and bata, and they're confused a lot. And you see this also in sort of official writing sometimes. Like if you go to restaurants, toe, how do you spell toe? That bijinga toe, pinle toe. It should be with pata correctly, but many people, also many restaurants, spell it with tata. Because people don't hear the difference, don't feel the difference anymore. The question is always, how long do you want to keep the spelling in the old way, and at what point do you want to change? I guess in a language like Burmese, with a long history, the spelling will be retained for a long time. And the prescriptive part of Burmese linguistics will insist on keeping the spellings apart. And this makes sense because there is a difference and it becomes more difficult to communicate in written form if you change the spelling too much and you obliterate too many differences. So I would insist on retaining the spelling. And I say it's not really regular. It just happens sometimes. Some people spell it like this, but even one person does not spell the same way all the time. So I think the spelling is good to be consistent and should be retained.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Okay, if there are no more questions, have a good time and see you all on Wednesday, I hope. Stay safe and enjoy reading as much as possible. I think that's the best thing you can do at the moment. Stay home and read as much as possible.
Okay, ပါဆရာကျေးဇူးတင်ပါတယ်ဆရာ
Okay, ကျေးဇူးပါနော်
ဟုတ်ကဲ့ပါ
Okay,
ကျေးဇူးပါဆရာ
ကျေးဇူးပါ